All right, so are you ready to like really dig deep today?
Oh, absolutely. Always up for a good deep dive.
Yeah, me too. Especially this topic, like discourse analysis. I feel like most people, even if they're, into language and communication, maybe haven't really explored this.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think kind of flies under the radar for a lot of folks.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's so fascinating and really relevant to, I think, like almost every aspect of our lives.
Oh yeah, totally. And we've got this awesome toolkit of articles here from the Discourse Analyzer AI toolkit, which
Oh, those are fantastic.
yeah, and we're just gonna like go through them and really unpack them and see what we can learn about this whole world of discourse analysis.
Sounds like fun.
It is going to be fun. So maybe we should like start with the basics. Like, what actually is discourse analysis? When we say that, what are we talking about?
Sure, yeah. I mean, at its core, discourse analysis is about going beyond just the words themselves. It's about understanding how language functions in social contexts to create meaning, shape identities, and even influence power dynamics.
Okay, so it's like not just about the dictionary definition of a word,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
like how it's actually used in the real world
Exactly.
and what it might reveal about like the speaker, the listener, and the whole situation.
Exactly. Think about it like this. The way you talk to your boss is probably very different from the way you talk to your best friend,
Oh,
right?
100%.
And that's discourse in action. You're adjusting your language, your tone, your entire communication style based on the context and the relationship.
Right, and you're also trying to achieve a certain goal with your language, whether it's to persuade, inform, entertain, or just connect.
Absolutely. And all of that is what discourse analysis tries to unpack and understand.
Okay, so it's not just about analyzing grammar or vocabulary, but also about the social and cultural factors that shape how we use language.
Precisely. And it can even get into things like body language, tone of voice, and nonverbal cues.
Wow, so it's really a holistic approach to understanding communication.
Exactly. It's about looking at the whole picture and understanding how language works in all its complexity.
Okay, so how did all of this come about? Like, what are the roots of discourse analysis as a field? Where did it all begin?
Well, it's a fascinating journey. Discourse analysis has roots in structuralism, which you've probably heard of.
I have, but I'm not sure I could explain it.
Sure, well, basically, it views language as the system of relationships where meaning is created through the differences and oppositions between elements.
Okay, so it's not about like the individual word itself, but how it relates to other words in a system.
Exactly. And then there's pragmatics, which is all about how context shapes meaning.
Okay, so like the same word can have different meanings depending on who's saying it, who they're saying it to, and the whole situation.
Right.
I'm getting it. So these are like the building blocks of discourse analysis.
Exactly. They provided the foundation for understanding how language works, and then discourse analysis emerged as a way to apply those understandings to real-world communication.
So it's not just about theory, but about actually analyzing language in action.
Exactly. And that's where it gets really interesting, because you start to see how language can be used to do all sorts of things, both positive and negative.
Okay, so give me an example. Like, how can discourse analysis be used to understand something like, I don't know, political speeches?
Oh, that's a great example. Political speeches are a goldmine for discourse analysis. One of the most influential developments in the field is critical discourse analysis, or CDA. And this approach specifically looks at how language is used to maintain or challenge power structures.
Okay, so it's about like how politicians use language to persuade or even manipulate their audience.
Precisely. Think about how certain words can be used to evoke strong emotions, create a sense of unity, or even demonize opponents.
Oh yeah, totally. Like when a politician uses fear-mongering tactics or labels their opponent as a radical or extremist, it's like they're trying to frame the whole debate in a way that benefits them.
Exactly. And CDA helps us see through those strategies and become more critical consumers of political discourse.
Okay, so we're talking about power dynamics, hidden meanings, and the ways in which language can be used to influence people's beliefs and actions. But who are some of the big thinkers behind these ideas? Like, who are the rock stars of discourse analysis that we should know about?
Well, there are so many brilliant minds who have contributed to this field, but one name that always comes up is Michel Foucault.
Foucault, yeah. I've heard that name, but to be honest, I'm a little intimidated by his work.
Oh, I totally get it. His writing can be pretty dense, but his ideas are incredibly powerful and have had a huge impact on how we understand the relationship between language, power, and knowledge.
Okay, so give me the Foucault for beginners crash course. What are his key ideas in a nutshell?
Well, Foucault argued that power and knowledge are deeply intertwined, and that discourse is the battleground where they play out.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
He believed that power isn't just something that some people have and others don't. It's more like a web or a network that runs through all aspects of society.
Oh, okay, I see. So it's not just about like who's in charge, but about how power operates in subtle and often invisible ways.
Exactly. And Foucault argued that discourse, the way we talk and think about things, plays a huge role in shaping those power relations.
So like the language we use actually helps to create and maintain certain power structures.
Precisely. And one of Foucault's key concepts is the idea of discursive formations.
Okay, discursive formations. That sounds pretty academic. Break it down for me.
Basically, a discursive formation is like a set of rules or a framework that shapes what can be said and thought about a particular topic in a given society at a given time.
So it's like those unspoken rules of what's acceptable to talk about and how we're supposed to talk about it.
Right. Exactly. And those rules aren't always explicit or written down somewhere.
Right.
They're often embedded in our language, our culture, and our institutions.
So it's like even if we're not consciously aware of it, the way we use language is already shaped by these pre-existing power structures.
You got it. And that's why Foucault's work is so relevant to discourse analysis. It helps us see how language isn't just a neutral tool for communication. It's a site where power is constantly being negotiated and contested.
Wow, I'm starting to realize how powerful language really is. It's not just about conveying information, it's about shaping our understanding of the world and influencing how we relate to each other.
You're absolutely right. And the more we understand about discourse, the better equipped we are to navigate those complex dynamics.
Okay, so we've got Foucault shaking things up with his ideas about power, knowledge, and discourse. Are there any other key figures we should know about?
Oh, absolutely. Another influential figure is Norman Fairclough, who really pushed the development of critical discourse analysis.
Okay, Fairclough. Tell me more about him and his contribution to the field.
Well, Fairclough argued that we need to look at how texts reflect social power dynamics.
Okay, so how does that work in practice? Give me an example.
Sure, like how certain media outlets might use biased language to shape public perception, or how political speeches can strategically manipulate audiences.
It's like they're using language as a weapon to control the narrative.
You got it. And that's where critical thinking and discourse analysis come in. By understanding these strategies, we can become more discerning consumers of information and less susceptible to manipulation.
Right, so we've talked about power, hidden meanings, and the influence of discourse on our perceptions. But what about the differences in how men and women communicate? That's always a hot topic.
Ah, yes. That's a fascinating area of research. And Deborah Tannen's work on gender and conversation is a classic example of how discourse analysis can shed light on those differences.
Okay, Deborah Tannen. I've definitely heard her name before. Remind me what her work is all about.
Well, she's shown how men and women often have different communication styles and how those contrasting styles can lead to misunderstandings and conflict.
It's like that classic stereotype of men interrupting more in conversations, while women are more likely to use cooperative language.
Exactly.
Like, oh yeah, I totally agree, instead of like, no, you're wrong.
Exactly. But it goes way beyond just interruptions. Tannen's research explores how men and women might have different ways of expressing rapport, giving feedback, or even telling stories.
That's so interesting. So it's not just about individual personalities, but also about these deeper cultural patterns that shape how men and women communicate.
Absolutely. And discourse analysis helps us to see beyond those individual interpretations and recognize the larger social and cultural forces shaping how we communicate.
Okay, so we've covered some pretty mind-blowing ideas about how language shapes our world and influences our perceptions. But how do discourse analysts actually do this work? Like, what tools and techniques do they use to uncover these hidden meanings and power dynamics?
Well, that's where we get into the real nitty-gritty of discourse analysis.
Okay, so give me the inside scoop. What are some of the methods and approaches that discourse analysts use to, like, crack the code of language?
Well, there's a whole toolkit of methods out there, and we'll dive into those next.
Perfect. I'm ready to put on my detective hat and get to work.
Excellent. Let's do it. Okay, so like I was saying, there's a whole toolkit of methods and approaches that discourse analysts use. It's not just about, like, having one magic formula.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
about choosing the right tool for the job, depending on what you're trying to understand.
Okay, so give me the rundown. What are some of the most common methods in this discourse analysis toolkit?
Well, one of the most common is content analysis.
Okay, content analysis.
Yeah. It's all about systematically categorizing the content of texts, whether they're written, spoken, or even visual.
Okay, so it's like taking a giant magnifying glass and examining the language for recurring patterns, themes, and dominant ideas.
Exactly. Imagine you're trying to understand how a particular company portrays itself in its advertising.
Okay.
You might use content analysis to track the frequency of certain words like innovation, community, or sustainability.
Oh, I see, yeah.
By analyzing how those words are used and in what context, you can start to uncover the company's brand identity and the values they're trying to project.
So you're not just reading the ad for its surface meaning, you're like breaking it down into these smaller units and looking for those subtle clues that reveal the underlying message.
Precisely. And you can apply this to all sorts of texts, political speeches, news articles, social media posts, you name it.
I'm starting to see how this can be applied to so many different areas, from understanding how politicians frame issues to analyzing how brands target consumers.
Exactly. And it can be really helpful for uncovering hidden biases or ideologies that might not be immediately apparent.
Okay, so that's content analysis. What other tools do we have in our discourse analysis arsenal?
Well, another powerful tool is conversation analysis.
Okay, conversation analysis. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, so this one focuses on the intricate details of spoken interactions, like how people manage conversations in real time.
Okay, so we're zooming in on those everyday conversations that we usually take for granted. What kind of insights can we gain from analyzing them?
Oh, so many. Conversation analysis pays attention to things like turn-taking, interruptions, pauses, repairs, and how people use language to achieve specific goals in conversation.
Okay, so it's not just about what we say, but how we say it, when we say it, and even when we choose to remain silent. It's like those awkward moments when you accidentally interrupt someone or when there's like an uncomfortable silence in a conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Those moments can actually tell us a lot about the social dynamics at play, like who has more power in the conversation or what the unspoken rules of communication are in that particular setting.
I see. And you can use this to study everything from doctor-patient interactions to courtroom proceedings to like first dates.
Exactly. And it can reveal a lot about power dynamics, social relationships, and the unspoken rules of communication that guide our interactions.
So we've got content analysis looking at the bigger picture of texts and conversation analysis zooming in on the micro level of spoken interactions.
Mm.
What other methods are out there?
Well, one approach that's particularly fascinating is the ethnography of communication.
Ethnography. Now, that sounds like something anthropologists would do. What does it have to do with discourse analysis?
Yeah, you're right. It does have roots in anthropology. But basically, it's about going beyond just analyzing texts or recordings and actually immersing yourself in a particular cultural group or community to study how language functions within that specific context.
Okay, so you're not just observing how people speak,
Mm.
but also trying to understand the cultural norms, rituals, and beliefs that shape those interactions.
Exactly. Imagine you're trying to understand how communication styles differ between, say, a rural farming community and a fast-paced urban environment. An ethnographer of communication would spend time in both communities observing how people use language in everyday life, from greetings and small talk to storytelling and conflict resolution.
I can see how that would provide a much richer and more nuanced understanding of how language is intertwined with culture, and how those cultural differences can sometimes lead to misunderstandings or communication breakdowns.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of considering the cultural context when analyzing discourse, as what might be considered polite or appropriate in one culture could be completely different in another.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about observing communication in different cultural contexts. But what about analyzing the discourse of specific influential figures? Like, how do we make sense of the language used by someone like, I don't know, Barack Obama or Oprah Winfrey?
Well, that's where Foucauldian discourse analysis comes in. Remember Foucault and his ideas about power, knowledge, and discourse?
Yeah.
Well, this approach builds on his work to examine how discourses, or systems of knowledge and language, shape our understanding of the world and ourselves.
Okay, so if you were analyzing Obama's speeches, you wouldn't just look at the words themselves, but also consider the broader historical and political context in which those speeches were delivered.
Exactly. You look at how he used language to construct his identity as a leader, how he framed complex issues, and how his discourse resonated with different audiences.
Okay, it's like you're trying to understand how his language choices both reflected and shaped the political landscape of his time.
You got it. And Foucauldian discourse analysis can be applied to a wide range of texts and figures, from historical documents to contemporary celebrities, to understand how language is used to construct meaning, influence perceptions, and exert power.
This is making me realize that language is never neutral. It's always embedded in a web of power relations and social meanings.
You're hitting on a key insight there, and that's what makes discourse analysis so fascinating. It helps us to see beyond the surface of language and to understand the complex ways in which it shapes our world.
Okay, so we've covered some pretty sophisticated approaches to analyzing discourse. But what about the stories we tell? How do those fit into the picture?
Oh, stories are essential. They're how we make sense of the world, connect with each other, and transmit knowledge and values across generations. And that's where narrative analysis comes in.
Okay, narrative analysis. That sounds like it could be applied to everything from like ancient myths to personal anecdotes to the latest Netflix series.
Exactly. Narrative analysis recognizes that storytelling is a fundamental way we make sense of the world and communicate our experiences. It involves examining things like plot structure, character development, themes, and the use of language to evoke emotions and convey messages.
So if I were analyzing someone's personal account of overcoming a challenge, I'd look at how they structured their story, the characters they included, and the language they used to convey their struggles and triumphs.
You got it. And by paying attention to those details, you can gain insights into their values, beliefs, and how they make sense of their experiences.
I can also see how narrative analysis could be really helpful for understanding how different cultures have different ways of telling stories.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes narrative analysis so fascinating. It allows us to explore the diversity of human experience through the lens of storytelling and to understand how culture shapes the ways we make sense of the world.
Okay, we've talked about observing communication in different cultural contexts, analyzing the discourse of powerful figures, and unpacking the stories we tell. But we live in a world that's increasingly saturated with images, videos, and sounds. It's not just about words anymore. So how does discourse analysis keep up with this, like, multimedia explosion?
That's where multimodal discourse analysis comes in.
Multimodal discourse analysis.
Yeah, this approach recognizes that communication is not limited to language alone. It takes into account all the different modes we use to create meaning, including images, sounds, gestures, and even spatial arrangements.
Okay, so if you were analyzing a website, you wouldn't just look at the text on the page, but also consider the images, videos, color schemes, and the overall layout.
Exactly. All of those elements work together to convey messages and shape our understanding of the information presented.
I never thought of it like that.
Yeah.
But it makes sense, right? Like a website with a sleek, minimalist design is going to convey a different message than one that's cluttered and chaotic.
Precisely. And multimodal discourse analysis is essential for understanding how websites, social media platforms, films, and other forms of multimedia communication shape our perceptions and influence our behavior.
I'm starting to see how this could be applied to, like, everything, from understanding how social media platforms use algorithms to shape our news feeds, to analyzing how advertising uses a combination of visuals and language to persuade us to buy products.
You got it. It's a really powerful approach for understanding how meaning is created in our increasingly multimedia world.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. It's amazing to see how many different tools and techniques discourse analysts have at their disposal. But I have to admit, it's a bit overwhelming. Like, how do you even choose which method to use?
Yeah, I get it. It can feel like a lot. But the key is to choose the approach that best suits your research question and the type of data you're working with.
So it's about being strategic and using the right tool for the job, just like any other skilled craftsperson.
Exactly. And sometimes the most insightful approach is to combine multiple methods to get a more complete and nuanced understanding of the discourse you're studying.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like having a toolbox full of different instruments, and you pick the ones that'll help you get the best results. But before we move on, there's one more method I'm curious about. What about corpus linguistics? That one sounds pretty high-tech.
It is. Corpus linguistics involves analyzing large collections of texts using computational tools. Imagine being able to study language patterns and trends across millions of words in a matter of seconds.
Wow, that's incredible. So instead of manually reading through all those texts, you can use computer programs to help you analyze the language and identify patterns that might not be visible to the naked eye.
Exactly. Corpus linguistics allows us to see the big picture of language use, revealing things like how certain words or phrases are commonly used together, how language changes over time, and how different groups might use language in distinct ways.
I can see how this would be incredibly valuable for everything from like tracking the spread of misinformation online to understanding how language evolves in response to social and political events to even helping to develop more sophisticated language models for AI.
Absolutely. Corpus linguistics is a powerful tool for researchers in a wide range of fields, and it's only becoming more powerful as AI technology advances.
Okay, I'm starting to feel like a discourse analysis pro, but I know there's more to this field than just the methods. What about the theoretical foundations that underpin these approaches? Like, what are the big ideas that guide discourse analysts in their work?
You're right. It's like we've been focusing on the tools and techniques, but now we need to understand the underlying principles, like the why behind the how.
Yeah, totally. It's like we've got this awesome toolkit, but now we need the instruction manual to really make sense of it all.
Exactly. And that's where theory comes in.
Okay, so like what are some of the big theoretical frameworks that shape how discourse analysts approach their work?
Well, one of the most influential is structuralism, which we touched on earlier.
Yeah, I remember that.
It argues that meaning isn't inherent in individual words or objects, but rather emerges from the relationships between them within a system.
So it's like the meaning of freedom isn't just like this abstract concept floating around.
Right.
It's defined by its relationship to other concepts like oppression, liberty, responsibility.
Exactly. And this idea had a big impact on discourse analysis because it suggests that we need to look beyond individual words and sentences
Okay.
to understand those underlying structures and systems that shape how language is used and how meaning is created.
So it's not just about what's being said, but also about the unspoken rules and conventions that govern how we communicate.
Precisely. And those rules are often embedded in our culture, our institutions, even our unconscious biases.
Right. So it's like we're all playing this language game with a set of rules that we might not even be aware of.
Exactly. And discourse analysis helps us to become more aware of those rules so we can play the game more effectively and maybe even challenge the rules themselves.
Okay, so structuralism is all about systems and structures.
Mm.
What other theoretical frameworks are important in discourse analysis?
Another key one is social constructionism.
Okay, social constructionism. That sounds interesting. Tell me more.
Well, social constructionism emphasizes the role of language and social interaction in shaping our understanding of reality.
Oh, okay, so it's like our reality isn't just out there waiting to be discovered.
Right.
It's actually something that we create together through our language and our interactions.
You got it. So, for example, our understanding of gender roles or race or even mental illness isn't based on some objective truth, but is shaped by the discourses circulating in society.
So the way we talk about these things actually influences how we perceive and experience them.
Precisely. And this idea is central to discourse analysis because it highlights how language isn't just a passive reflection of reality.
Yeah.
It's an active force in shaping our perceptions, beliefs, and values.
Okay, so we've got structuralism focusing on those systems of language and social constructionism, emphasizing how those systems shape our understanding of reality. What other theoretical lenses do discourse analysts use?
Well, a more critical perspective comes from, you guessed it, critical discourse analysis, or CDA.
CDA. Yes, we've talked about CDA in terms of its methods, but what are the theoretical ideas that drive this approach?
Well, CDA draws on a range of critical theories that emphasize the role of power, ideology, and social inequality in shaping discourse.
Okay, so CDA analysts aren't just interested in describing how language is used.
Right.
They're also interested in understanding how language can be used to maintain power structures, perpetuate inequality, or even resist those systems of domination.
Exactly. CDA is all about uncovering those hidden agendas, those power dynamics that are often embedded in everyday language.
So it's like CDA analysts are like linguistic detectives looking for clues about how language is being used to influence, persuade, or even manipulate.
That's a great way to put it. And this can be applied to all sorts of texts, from news articles and political speeches to advertising and social media posts.
I can see how this would be really helpful for understanding how certain groups in society might be marginalized or silenced through language.
Exactly. CDA provides a framework for analyzing those power dynamics and for challenging those discourses that perpetuate inequality and injustice.
Okay, so we've talked about structuralism, social constructionism, and CDA. These are all pretty, heady theoretical frameworks. Is there a perspective that focuses more on the practical, everyday ways in which we use language to make sense of the world?
There is. It's called ethnomethodology, and it examines the methods people use to create a shared understanding of the world in their everyday interactions.
Ethnomethodology, okay. So it's about how we navigate those, seemingly mundane social situations and interactions, like waiting in line at the grocery store or having a casual conversation with a neighbor.
Exactly. Ethnomethodology is interested in those unwritten rules and unspoken assumptions that guide our social behavior and allow us to make sense of what's going on around us.
So it's like we're all participating in this elaborate social dance, following these intricate steps and cues, even if we're not consciously aware of them.
Precisely. And those unspoken rules can vary widely depending on the culture, the context, even the individuals involved.
Right, and that's why things can get so awkward when those rules are broken or when we misinterpret the cues.
Exactly. Ethnomethodology helps us to understand how those breakdowns happen and how we can become more sensitive to the subtle ways in which we create meaning together through our interactions.
This is making me think about how much we take for granted in our everyday conversations.
Right.
Like all those little nods and pauses and ahas that help us to keep the conversation flowing smoothly.
Exactly. And those micro interactions can reveal a lot about the power dynamics, the relationships, and the shared understandings that underpin our social world.
Okay, so we've covered some big picture theoretical frameworks, but what about the nitty-gritty of how meaning is created in specific contexts? Like, how do we account for those subtle nuances of communication that can make all the difference in how a message is interpreted?
That's where pragmatics comes in.
Okay, pragmatics, give me the lowdown.
Pragmatics focuses on how meaning is created and interpreted in context, taking into account the speaker's intentions, the listener's understanding, and the social situation.
So it's like understanding that the phrase break a leg doesn't actually mean you want someone to injure themselves,
Right.
but rather is an expression of good luck in a theatrical context.
Exactly. Pragmatics helps us to understand those unspoken rules of conversation, those subtle cues and inferences that allow us to go beyond the literal meaning of words and grasp the speaker's intended message.
This is making me think about how important it is to be aware of our audience and the context when we communicate, as the same message can be interpreted in vastly different ways.
You're spot on, and that's why miscommunications happen so easily.
Right, because we're all bringing our own assumptions and experiences to the table.
Exactly. Pragmatics helps us to become more mindful communicators by taking those factors into account.
Okay, so we've explored structuralism, social constructionism, CDA, ethnomethodology, and pragmatics. Phew, that's a lot of theoretical ground we've covered.
Yeah.
Is there a theoretical framework that challenges those systems and structures of meaning? Like one that embraces ambiguity and the fluidity of language?
There is. Post-structuralism emerged as a response to, and in many ways a critique of, structuralism.
Oh, okay, interesting. Tell me more about post-structuralism and how it differs from structuralism.
Well, while structuralism emphasizes those systems and structures that shape meaning, post-structuralism argues that meaning is always fluid, contested, and open to multiple interpretations.
So, while structuralism might see language as a relatively stable system with clear rules,
Right.
post-structuralism sees language as a constantly shifting landscape where meaning is always up for grabs.
Exactly. Post-structuralism argues that meaning is never fixed or inherent in language itself,
Okay.
but is produced through that interplay of language, power, and individual interpretation.
That makes sense. Like, even if we're using the same words, we might understand them in slightly different ways based on our own experiences and perspectives.
Exactly. And post-structuralism encourages us to be critical of that idea that there's one correct interpretation of any text or utterance.
Right. Because meaning is always going to be influenced by the context, the reader, and a whole bunch of other factors.
You got it. So it's not about finding the one true meaning, but rather about exploring the multiple meanings that are possible.
Okay, this has been such an incredible deep dive into discourse analysis. We've gone from the micro level of individual words to the macro level of social structures and power dynamics.
It's been a journey, hasn't it?
It really has. I'm starting to see language in a whole new light, like it's this incredibly powerful tool that we use to shape our world and make sense of our experiences.
And that's the beauty of discourse analysis. It helps us to become more aware of that power so we can use it more consciously and ethically.
Absolutely. And I think this is especially important in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides, and it's not always easy to tell what's true, what's biased, and what's just plain manipulation.
You're so right. And that's why critical thinking skills are more important than ever.
So how can all of this make me a better communicator? What are some key takeaways that our listeners can apply in their own lives?
That's a great question. I think one of the most important things is to simply become more aware of language and how it's being used.
So it's about paying attention to the words people choose, the tone they use, the underlying messages they might be sending, even unconsciously.
Exactly. And start to notice the patterns in your own communication as well. Are there certain words or phrases you tend to overuse? Are there ways you could be more precise or impactful with your language?
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of using filler words like and like way too much. It's something I need to work on.
Another helpful tip is to be more conscious of the context in which you're communicating.
Right.
Who are you talking to? What's the purpose of the conversation? What are those social norms and expectations?
It's like being a social chameleon, adapting your communication style to fit the situation.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask for clarification if you're not sure what someone means.
That's a good one. I think a lot of us are afraid to ask for clarification because we don't want to seem dumb.
But it's actually a sign of intelligence and respect to make sure you're on the same page.
Absolutely. And it can prevent a lot of misunderstandings and conflicts down the road.
And finally, be mindful of the power dynamics at play in any communication situation.
Oh,
Who
yeah.
has more power? Who's more likely to be listened to? Whose voices are being amplified? And whose voices are being silenced?
Yeah, that's such an important point, especially when we're talking about issues of social justice and equity.
Exactly. We need to be aware of those power dynamics so we can create more inclusive and equitable communication spaces.
This has been such a mind-blowing journey into the world of discourse analysis. It's incredible to see how much power lies in the words we use and the ways in which we communicate.
Language is truly a force to be reckoned with, and the more we understand about it, the more effectively we can use it to connect, persuade, inform, and inspire.
So true. Well, I think we've covered just about everything we wanted to discuss today, right?
I think so. We've really dug deep into the theory, the methods, and the real-world applications of discourse analysis.
It's been an amazing deep dive, and I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too, and I hope our listeners have as well.
So to our amazing listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on this exciting journey into the fascinating world of discourse analysis,
We hope you've enjoyed it.
and that you're continuing to explore the power of language in your own lives.
Keep those conversations flowing, keep asking questions, and keep challenging those assumptions.
Because the more we understand about how language works, the better equipped we are to create a more just, equitable, and understanding world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Until next time, happy analyzing.